Hello, today we are going to discuss the theme of the novel A House for Mr. Biswas, written by V.S. Naipaul. The dominant theme of Naipaul's this novel, A House for Mr. Biswas, is the protagonist's painful quest for identity. It deals with Mr. Mohan Biswas's development as an individual and his struggle for survival in an alien culture. The novel delineates the rebellion of a self-respecting man against a tyrannical society. The crux of the novel lies in the transformation of Mr. Biswas from a slave into a free man. The symbol of this emancipation of Mr. Biswas is undoubtedly his house, as has been reflected in the prologue of the novel, where he says how terrible it would have been at this time to be without it, worse, to have lived without even attempting to lay claim to one's portion of the earth. Unquote. The novel begins with the description of the birth of Mr. Biswas as an ominous child who is born with 6 fingers in one hand. The Pandit predicts him to be unlucky for the family, especially for the father. The prophecy of the Pandit astonishingly proves to be true when, while searching for Mr. Biswas, his father Raghu jumps into the pool and dies. In this way, he carries the stigma of being a boy who has eaten up his own father. Mr. Biswas spends his childhood in the house of Tara, his mother's sister, and later moves to Tulsi house in Arvakhas. After his initial failure to establish himself as an assistant to Pandit Jairam, Mr. Biswas is married to Shama, a daughter of the Tulsi family, living at Hanuman house. Unlike the other sons-in-law of the Tulsi family, Mr. Biswas finds it difficult to cope with the servile, traditional and conservative life at Hanuman house, which is a symbol of the old Hindu culture with its emphasis on the joint family system. The rebellion of Mr. Biswas against the system is the first step in the development of his personality. Mr. Biswas is, however, expelled from Hanuman house because of his rebellious attitude and is sent to the chase to take charge of the Tulsi food shop. But he fails to function as a shopkeeper and to deal with his customers. Besides, due to constant goading of his wife Shama, he has to hold a house blessing ceremony which entails a large expenditure. Mr. Biswas is also dissatisfied with the kind of accommodation he is provided at the new place. He also protests against his firstborn child being named by Seth and Hari without consulting him in the matter. Adding insult to injury, he is also mentioned as a laborer in the birth certificate of the child. Unable to adjust himself in the Tulsi barracks, Mr. Biswas decides to build a house of his own at Green Vale. He does not have enough money for the purpose, and the house cannot be completed. Only one room in the house is habitable, and Mr. Biswas shifts into it. But he doesn't get any peace of mind over there. On the contrary, he suffers a nervous breakdown and has to be carried to Hanuman house in order to be nursed back to health. His house at Green Vale is later burned down by laborers. Thus, his desire for establishing his identity by possessing a house ends in a fiasco. After recovering from illness, Mr. Biswas leaves Hanuman house once again and goes to Port of Spain. But there he has to live in the house of his sister Dehuti and her husband Ramchand. When he gets the job of a newspaper reporter, Mrs. Tulsi invites him to live in her house at Port of Spain on a nominal rent. Mr. Biswas sends for his family and shifts to Mrs. Tulsi's house. Thus, independence still eludes Mr. Biswas like a tantalizing beauty. After some time, Mrs. Tulsi moves to her estate at Short Hills and invites Mr. Biswas to join her with his family. Mr. Biswas lives there for some time, but soon afterwards builds a house of his own on the Tulsi estate. After shifting into this house, he at last becomes independent and heaves a sigh of relief. But this hard-earned independence proves to be quite short-lived. As ill luck would have it, his new house catches fire and is burned down, thereby making the protagonist homeless once again. Mr. Biswas goes back to Port of Spain and gets a couple of rooms in the previous abode belonging to Mrs. Tulsi. Many other members of the Tulsi clan shift to this house, and Mr. Biswas has no peace of mind. To make the matter worse, confounded, Owaid returns from abroad, and the 2 rooms occupied by Mr. Biswas are given to him. Mr. Biswas has to shift to another room in the same congested and noisy house. Mr. Biswas quarrels with Mrs. Tulsi and Owaid and is ultimately compelled to quit the house. He then purchases a house for $5,500 in Sikkim Street in Port of Spain, though he has to borrow $4,000 from his uncle Ajodha. In this way, Mr. Biswas is able to fulfill his long-cherished ambition of becoming the owner of a house. But this odyssey has a telling effect on his health, and he has been drained and fatigued by this time and falls ill. In fact, he has been cheated in this deal, as the house is hardly worth living. However, this house has a great significance to his life, as it symbolizes the story of a man's struggle to make something valuable out of circumscribed and mediocre existence. It is a struggle symbolized by the hero's effort to own his house, which in a way is to own his own house. Apart from Mr. Biswas, the novel also depicts the rebellion and consequent evolution of many other members of the Tulsi clan. For instance, Shekhar marries a Christian girl, which is against the conservative ideals of the Tulsi family. After some time, Govind also feels discontented with his life at Hanuman house and stops working for Mrs. Tulsi. Another son-in-law called W.C. Tuttle also asserts his independence by purchasing a house of his own and shifting to it. Similarly, Owaid comes back from England as a completely westernized man. He leaves his mother and settles down in another town with a Christian wife. The rebellion of these individuals is a symbol of social development in general. The old Hindu culture, having come into contact with an alien culture, gradually crumbles and disintegrates. Mr. Biswas's quest for identity is also reflected in his relations with his wife and children. Even after her marriage with Mr. Biswas, Shama often shows her displeasure to live with him and is in constant habit of returning to Hanuman house. While living at Chase, Shama once shouts at Mr. Biswas, "Give up the shop and return to Hanuman house," she says. She always treats Hanuman house as her real home and ultimate refuge. Besides, the 2 children of Mr. Biswas make him feel worthless and insecure at Hanuman house. Mr. Biswas, like all the fathers at Hanuman house, had come from nothing, and the only people who had a proper family were the Tulsis. That is why Mr. Biswas is in constant quest for identity, although it leads him to numerous displacements. Naipaul has thus created a world of homeless nomadic migrants making middle passages from Africa or India to the West Indies, thence to England and back again. For after 300 years, there is no society and no system of values in which they can take root. Thank you.